It was a cold autumn evening, the kind where the sun sets a little too quickly, casting long shadows that stretch across the empty streets. Emily, a 15-year-old girl, was walking home alone from school. She had taken this path 100 times before, but tonight felt different. The trees seemed darker, and the air carried an unsettling chill. She quickened her pace, but the sound of footsteps behind her echoed through the silent road. The problem was, there was no one there. Emily had always prided herself on being fearless. As an only child, she often spent time alone, perfectly comfortable in her own company. Her parents trusted her to walk back home from school, as the route was familiar. But this particular evening felt off from the moment. She stepped outside the school gates. The sky was overcast, and a thick fog had rolled in, blurring the familiar outlines of the houses and the street signs. She took a deep breath and began the 20-minute walk back home. The streetlights flickered as she passed, and a gust of wind rustled the leaves. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure at the end of the street. But when she blinked, it was gone. Emily brushed it off as her imagination playing tricks on her. As she continued walking, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, only to find the street empty. Trying to dismiss the gnawing unease, she pulled out her phone and plugged in her earphones, hoping some music would distract her. The soft hum of her favorite song filled her ears, but the feeling persisted like a shadow hovering just out of sight. The sky was overcast, and a thick fog had rolled in, blurring the familiar outlines of the houses and the street signs. She took a deep breath and began the 20-minute walk back home. The streetlights flickered as she passed, and a gust of wind rustled the leaves. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure at the end of the street. But when she blinked, it was gone. Emily brushed it off as her imagination playing tricks on her. As she continued walking, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, only to find the street empty. Trying to dismiss the gnawing unease, she pulled out her phone and plugged in her earphones, hoping some music would distract her. The soft hum of her favorite song filled her ears, but the feeling persisted like a shadow hovering just out of sight. 5 minutes into the walk, Emily noticed something strange. The street that was usually buzzing with live people returning from work, kids playing, cars honking, was eerily silent. No lights in the houses, no movement in the windows. It was as if the entire neighborhood had vanished. The music in her earphones began to distort. Static crackled through the speakers, and her phone screen flickered. Frowning, she pulled the earphones out, only to hear faint, slow footsteps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She stopped and turned around. Nothing, just an empty road stretching behind her, the fog creeping in closer. She tried to laugh at her own paranoia, telling herself it was just the weather playing tricks on her senses. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Emily resumed walking, faster this time, but the footsteps returned steadier, more deliberate. Emily's breath quickened. She started walking even faster, almost at a jog, her sneakers pounding against the pavement. The footsteps behind her mirrored her speed, growing louder. She couldn't take it anymore. She spun around, fully expecting to confront someone, but there was no one there. Just an empty road, as before. A chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, the streetlight above her flickered and went out, plunging her section of the street into darkness. The remaining streetlights down the road began to go out one by one, like a wave of shadows creeping toward her. Emily's heart raced, panic clawing at her chest. She pulled out her phone desperate to call her mum, but the screen was dead. No signal, no power. As she looked up, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. This time, it wasn't her imagination. It was real. A tall, dark silhouette stood there, motionless, watching her. Frozen in place, Emily's mind raced. Who was this? Why were they just standing there? The figure took a step forward, and then another, slowly, deliberately. Emily's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, she turned and bolted down the street. Her breath came in sharp, frantic bursts as her legs carried her as fast as they could. The footsteps behind her echoed louder, faster now, matching her sprint. She darted into an alleyway, hoping to lose whoever or whatever was following her. The alley was narrow and dark, the walls closing in around her. She pressed herself against the brick wall, her chest heaving, trying to quiet her breath. The footsteps slowed, as if the figure was searching for her. Through the thin veil of fog, she saw the shadow pass by the alley entrance. She held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. The figure paused for a moment, its head tilting as if sensing her presence. But then it continued walking down the street. Emily let out a shaky sigh of relief. She had to get home. She couldn't stay out here any longer. Just as she was about to leave the alley, a soft whisper reached her ears. It wasn't a voice, more like a breath, a presence lingering too close. Emily. Her name whispered from behind her. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes wide with terror. There, standing inches away from her, was the figure. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the dark. She screamed and ran, her legs barely carrying her as the world seemed to close in around her. Every street she turned down was unfamiliar, the houses morphing into twisted, unrecognizable shapes. It was as if the neighborhood was warping around her, trapping her in a maze with no way out. At last, she saw her house in the distance, a beacon of hope amidst the madness. She sprinted toward it, her legs burning, her lungs on fire. But just as she reached the front yard, the figure appeared again, blocking her path. This time, it spoke. "You cannot escape." Its voice was a low, guttural growl, filled with malice. Emily backed away, her body trembling. "What do you want from me?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. The figure stepped forward, raising a hand. "You were never meant to leave. This is where you belong." As the figure reached for her, the world seemed to blur, the ground beneath her feet dissolving into darkness. Emily screamed, falling into the abyss. Emily's eyes snapped open. She was lying in her bed, drenched in sweat. Was it all a dream? Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around her room. Everything seemed normal. But when she looked at her phone, she saw the time. 9:30 p.m., the exact time she had been walking home the previous night. And then she heard the soft, slow footsteps outside her window.